Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our presentation this morning. Please continue to eat throughout the presentation and help yourself to more as you like. My name is Peter Federico, and I'm the CEO of the Workers' Compensation Board. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning for you folks here in the room with us in Regina, as well as all of those who are joining us through webinar as well. What we're going to share with you today is the impact of implementation of the enhanced rate-making model, which will come into effect for the 2018 premiums. So we made the decision not to implement the new model for the 2017 premium rates, because as you'll see, some of the impacts of the changes can be fairly significant on some of the industry sectors. And so our board and we felt it important that we provide the opportunity to provide some information, educationals, around exactly what is changing and how that might potentially impact folks for purposes of A, understanding, and B, to perhaps start preparing for or planning for, what might be coming in 2018. So what we're going to show you here this morning is not the 2018 premium rate. We're not going to attempt to guess what that would be because we're quite a bit short of data in order to do that at this point. But we're going to show you a comparison between the 2017 rates as currently calculated and published compared to what the rate would have been had we implemented the new model effective January 1st, 2017. So again, just gives you a sense of the magnitude of kind of the change, the order of the magnitude of the change that may in fact impact your industry sector. So we have a bit of an agenda here this morning. We'll have plenty of time. We've got 2 hours allocated to this session. It'll take me about an hour to get through the presentation, and then the remaining hour is open for questions either here on the floor in our meeting room or online through the webinar site. So our agenda this morning, briefly provide a little bit of background about Workers' Compensation Board in general, how it came to exist, why it exists, what the purpose of our rate model review was, and then to share with you the industry impacts of the various enhancements that have been made to the rate-making model, and then to advise you of what next steps are. So workers' compensation came about as a result of an initiative taken in Ontario in the early 1900s. So prior to 1915, in Canada anyways, there was no workers' compensation system. There was no insurance for workers who might sustain a workplace injury. So their only recourse was to actually sue the employer. And in most cases, were not successful in actually being able to do that. But when they were successful, it often meant the demise of the employer, which forced them into bankruptcy. Neither situation particularly helpful from an economic perspective. The Ontario government began to notice fairly dramatic increase in the draw on their social security systems, because workers, in the absence of a work injury insurance program and or the ability to sue the employer for compensation. And remember, back in those days, we didn't have Medicare, so you were actually paying for medical costs. Having no ability to pay for the medical or provide for their families, workers ended up on social assistance. And this began elevating the cost of those programs, and so the government, recognizing this in 1913, appointed a guy by the name of William Meredith, who's now known as Sir William Meredith, to study and propose an alternative to what the current system might be. And so Meredith came up with this notion of creating a workers' compensation system, and the approach that he took is often referred to as the historic compromise. What the historic compromise refers to is an agreement between workers and employers back in the 1900s that employers would promise that they would pay the full costs of all claims, work-related injury claims, including the medical and wage loss and any rehabilitation costs that might be associated with a workplace injury. And in exchange for that, the workers gave up the right to sue their employer. So the workers' only recourse was now to file a claim with the workers' compensation system. They could no longer sue the employer, but the employer, on the other hand, had to 100% fund the system. So Meredith anchored this workers' compensation system that he conceived of around 5 principles which have stood the test of time and continue to support all compensation boards in Canada, compensation systems in Canada, and actually beyond. So the first principle he talked about was that this needed to be a no-fault system. Workers do not have to prove negligence on the part of the employer. The employer cannot say it was your fault and therefore we're not buying the claim. It was totally a no-fault system. Secondly, Meredith said there has to be security of benefits in the system. In other words, the benefits to which a worker might be entitled should never be in jeopardy because the system can't afford to pay them. There has to be security of benefits. So if you look at Saskatchewan's legislation, which by the way came into effect in 1929, there are provisions in our law that require us to be fully funded at all times, so that the benefits, the payment of the ongoing benefits to injured worker is never ever in jeopardy. Thirdly, Meredith said the system ought to be funded through something called collective liability. And collective liability simply means the sharing in the liability associated with the risks. So if you think about this in terms of our own home or auto insurance plans, you know, I'm a part of some kind of risk pool. So based on the vehicle, the kind of vehicle that I drive, and probably my age, I am lumped in with a whole bunch of other vehicle owners. And likewise, as a homeowner, my home insurance is covered as a result of me being grouped with a bunch of individuals in a similar location with a similar house with similar risks attached to it. And together we share in the costs of those claims. So if my house burnt down or I totaled off my vehicle, I wouldn't actually have to pay the replacement costs of that vehicle. Rather, that would have been covered through the premiums paid, and the premiums determined by the collective risk of the entire group. Fourthly, Meredith said, in order to avoid any sort of political interference in the process of establishing premium rates and or benefit entitlement, the system had to be administered by an independent agency at arm's length from the government. And lastly, Meredith envisioned that the system needed to be of exclusive jurisdiction. In other words, what that means is only the workers' compensation system can sell workers' compensation insurance. You can't go buy this through a private insurance or someplace else. You must come to the workers' compensation board to buy the coverage. And within the system itself, the board that administers that plan would have exclusive jurisdiction to determine all matters under the Act. As I said, those 5 principles continue to be as valid today as they were in 1915 when he introduced them through the legislation in Ontario, as they are today, and continue to support compensation systems, quite frankly, around the world. So what's the process by which we actually set premium rates? Well, there's actually 3 steps that establish the amount of premium that employers would pay us. And the first has to do with industry classification. So in Saskatchewan, there are roughly 47,000 employers registered with the Workers' Compensation Board. What we do is we take those 47,000 employers and we group them into what we call rate codes, or if you want to think about it as risk pools, based on their primary business activity. So everybody in G22 is, to one extent or another, involved in the provision of healthcare services. And so all of those employers with similar business activities and risks are grouped together in these rate codes and share together collectively in the risks associated with all of the injury activity within those rate codes. So everybody in G22 healthcare shares in the costs of all of the claims that occur within all of the employers in that G22 rate code. And the same is true for all other industries. So the bankers are grouped together with other bankers, the truckers together in their own individual rate codes. And the premium rate is determined at that rate code level. So what is the collective experience of the employers in that particular rate code that would then determine the premium that they would have to pay. Second step is the process by which we actually determine how much we have to collect in premiums, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. So after that second step, what we arrive at is what we call our base industry rate. So every employer in G22 would start off by paying the same base premium rate. But recognizing that individual employers within that group might have different experience than the other employer, and to hold individual employers accountable for their own experience, we introduced something called the Experience Rating Program, which has two streams. The first one being the standard part of the program. The standard program is designed for smaller employers who pay us less than $21,000 in premium over the last most 3 recent years. That program is frequency-based, so it's based on the number of injuries that you would have. And depending on the level of injuries that you have, you'd be entitled to a discount from your base premium rate, or you would pay a surcharge. The maximum discount in the standard program is 25%, and the maximum surcharge is 75%. So if you're a maximum surcharged employer in the standard program, compared to someone who gets maximum discount, there's a 100% difference in the final premium that you would pay us as an individual employer. The second program is the advanced program, and that's for the larger employers who pay us at least $21,000 in premium over the previous 3 years. That program is cost-based. So it's based on the cost of claims, not the number of claims. And if your individual employer experience is better than the average for your industry, that entitles you to a discount, which can be as much as 30%. If your injury experience is worse than the average for your industry, you could be subject to a surcharge to a maximum of 200%. So there's a 230% spread between the highest surcharged employer and the highest discounted employer within the advanced program. After all those 3 steps go, so we classify you in your particular industry code, we determine your premium rate through the rate making model, which again we're here to talk about. We then apply experience rating to your individual premium rate, and that gives you your final rate for the year. So why did we undertake this rate model review? So as part of the review of our overall financial system, we began by looking at the way that we invest our funds. So when we established the premium rates for 2017, what we were seeking to do was to establish the premium rate necessary, collected today, to pay for all of the costs of all of the injuries that would occur in 2017. We don't pay all those costs in 2017. They could be paid out for as long as 50 years, depending on how long the claim goes. The age of the worker, so if the worker is 15, our benefits end at age 65. It could be 50 years that we would pay that. So we're trying to estimate the costs for the claims that would occur in 2017 as far out as 50 years ahead, and collect the present value of all those costs today through a premium rate. Because we're not spending all that money, we invest those premiums. And those premiums are expected to earn a certain rate of return in order to fund the future costs that have to be paid. Kind of like a pension. So we first undertook a review of our investment policy, the way that we allocate our investment funds into the various asset classes that are available, being equities or bonds or real estate, mortgages, those kinds of things. And following that review, we undertook something called an asset liability study, which simply seeks to look how closely we match the income flow coming out of our investments with the cash flow requirements in order to meet future payments. So we have to achieve a certain rate of return, which is assumed in the calculation of the premium rates, in order to have sufficient funds to pay those costs. And that is what, quite frankly, we seek to do. So as part of that asset liability study, to see how closely our assets match our liabilities, the actuary we hired, a firm called Eckler, determined that we should probably review our rate-making model because it's an integral part of our revenue generation stream. Secondly, we were hearing from employers, particularly in recent years, that they didn't feel that the rate model as it exists was reactive enough to changes in experience in the industry. And so for those two reasons, the board asked us, the administration, to undertake a review of the way in which premium rates were established, that second step in the rate-making process. What we sought to do in reviewing and enhancing the model was to balance these often competing principles within the model. So on the one hand, we want to ensure that industries are held accountable for their own injury experience. On the other hand, we want to ensure that we maintain this collective liability. And a part of collective liability is to ensure that employers are not unduly burdened by extremely expensive claims. If we increase the accountability of the rate code, we decrease the collective liability and vice versa. So we're really trying to balance those two competing principles. On the other hand, we understand and recognize how important it is for employers to have some stability in their premium rates so that the rate's not whipsawed year after year. And large increase one year, a decrease next year, and so on and so forth. So we seek through the rate-making model to actually generate rates that are quite stable, but at the same time balance that against the reactivity of the model. So if we make the model too reactive, we create volatility in your premium rates. They'll bounce around. If we create too much stability in the premium rates, we withhold the reactivity of the model to what the current experience or most recent experience of the employer is. So we're really trying to balance these four principles that underlie the rate-making process in as transparent a way as possible. So we're going to talk a lot about the elements of the new model here today and the existing model, and I'm going to try not to make this terribly technical because it's important for us to have you understand the process by which we actually determine how much we feel you need to pay us. So the fundamental, I guess, things we were trying to maintain as we pursued the new model, what we're really trying to do, as I indicated earlier, is to predict how much revenue we have to generate through the premiums in order to pay for the cost of next year's claims. So we're hoping at an average rate of $1.24 that we've established for 2017, that money is going to be sufficient to pay all of the costs associated with all injuries that occur in 2017. So in conducting the review, we wanted Eckler to look at the credibility of the model from the perspective of it generating not more than we need, but not less than we need in terms of premiums required to fund the system. We also wanted to be sure that the model is fair and equitable to all employers, and that it be actuarially based. So making it as scientific as possible and removing the need to intervene in order to produce some of the outcomes that we're looking for in terms of maintaining principles like fairness and equity. So what were the key findings of the Eckler review? By the way, if you're interested in reading the paper that they published on the rate model review, it is actually posted on our website. It's quite an extensive document and in some areas gets quite technical, but it is there if you're interested in diving a little deeper into that, as is the asset liability study. So what Eckler actually determined is the process of determining the premium rate is sound and works well in terms of generating the revenue requirement at what we call the board level. And what do I mean by board level? Board level simply refers to the collective experience of all 50 rate codes that we've established. So this classification process that I talked about earlier results in us dividing up those 47,000 registered employers into 50 specific industry rate codes. When we take the collective experience of all 50 together, like roll it up to what we call the board level, the model works very well in terms of predicting the future costs and premiums required in order to fund those costs. What Eckler found, however, it needed some refinement, not an overhaul, but some refinement, because it was not doing as good a job when we got down to the individual 50 industry codes. And quite frankly, over the years, what they found is, as a result of some changes, economically and with respect to injury prevention and those kinds of things, some of the principles in terms of accountability and reactivity had deteriorated over time and required us to intervene in order to maintain things like rate stability and reduce volatility. Eckler made 7 recommendations, and I'm going to talk in some level of detail about all of them except one. I just want to cover that off quickly right now. And that's the second one around classification. So what Eckler noted was that in Saskatchewan, we have, as I said, we have these 50 rate codes, but there's some rate codes that are very, very small, only a few hundred employers in that rate code. And if any of you remember if you were unfortunate enough to have to take stat classes in university, the smaller your sample size, the less reliable it is in terms of being able to predict the future. So if you have even if when you do your surveys, if your survey numbers are not representative of the overall population, it's not really a very credible piece. And so what Eckler noted is that we actually don't have a process where we systematically or periodically review the classification system. Eckler said we ought to build that process. We ought to build a process that would require periodic reviews of the classification system with the thought of perhaps merging some of these smaller rate codes together to create a larger sample size, more representative perhaps of experience. Well, what the board has decided is they would like us to build that process, but there are no plans in the immediate future until the process is built, which of course would have to include consultation with employers impacted by any changes and a fair bit of analysis. So the board has asked us to build that process, which we will do in due course, but there are no immediate plans to merge any of the existing 50 rate codes. So moving forward, at least into the foreseeable future, we will continue to set premium rates based on the 50 rate classifications that we currently have. So before I get into the detail of the other elements of Eckler's recommendations, I just want to reinforce that what I'm going to show you in the next few slides are the industry impacts on the G22 rate code had we implemented the new model for January 1, 2017 compared to the existing model itself. We don't know what the impact might be on the 2018 rates at this particular point in time because we don't have the experience, the claims experience to predict what the 2018 experience might be. So what you're going to see is simply a proxy for the order of magnitude that you might be impacted by as a result of these enhancements to the system. The 2018 rates will be released in the fall, will include these enhancements to the model itself, and will be updated for current injury experience. So, the first recommendation that Eckler made had to do with this thing called credibility, and very much refers to what I was just talking about from a classification perspective. Credibility technically really refers to the reliability of historic experience in predicting future experience. So to the extent that you have a large enough sample size that is representative of what the future might look like, it can be reliable. But in the case of extremely small rate codes that don't have that history of experience built into them, just because there are not enough employers in that group, it becomes more and more difficult to predict. Under the current model, what we've been doing in order to mitigate that issue is we've been adjusting the experience of the low credible industry codes using the experience, the injury experience at the board level of all 50 rate codes combined. So what that helped to do was increase the reliability of the experience in those small rate codes. Eckler said that that's not really what we should be doing. It doesn't really hold the industry code very accountable for their own experience if you are intervening, if you will, by applying the injury experience at the board level to the individual industry code. But Eckler recognized that you had to have sufficient experience, historic experience, in order to make the predictability valid. Under the current model, for all industry codes, we calculate the average cost of all claims paid in the last 5 years. So for 2017 premium rates, we use the 5 most recently completed injury years. So that would be 2011 to 2015. All the costs paid in each of those 5 years, I'm oversimplifying, but are added together and a 5-year average is calculated, and that 5-year average is used to predict what 2017 experience might be. Again, under the current model, we would calculate that average and we would adjust it upwards or downwards depending on what the overall injury experience was for all 50 rate codes taken together. Eckler said you could continue, so we fundamentally continue to maintain that underlying principle. We will use historic averages to predict future experience. However, Eckler said if the rate code's too small, you can't limit it to just 5 years. Expand it to 10 years for those non-credible injury codes. So for an industry code to be credible, under Eckler's definition, it should have $16.5 million in claims costs flowing through it over the previous 5 years. So if you have $16.5 million or more flowing through your rate code, you would be considered to be 100% credible. Eckler said that 5 years experience is reliable for those kinds of rate codes that are 100% credible, is reliable in predicting what the following year's experience ought to be. However, if the credibility falls below 100%, so you have less than $16.5 million, we need to use a blend of 5 and 10-year experience. So if you have $10 million of costs running through your industry code, that equates to about 60% credibility. So for that type of industry code, we would use 60% of the average for the last 5 years, and we'd use 40% of the average for the last 10 years. And that blended average would be what we used in order to forecast what the future costs might be. Now, G22 happens to be 100% credible. So it'll be 100% reliant on its own experience over the most recent 5 years. So what's the impact, if any, on this? So before I flip to the chart, generally speaking, because we adjusted all industry codes experience for the board level experience, if your industry code experience is worse than the board experience, by us not doing that anymore and now just looking at 5 or 10-year average costs, would result in your rate increasing. If your injury experience is better than the board average, then this would have the effect of reducing your premium rate. So what happened in G22? There would actually be a reduction had we implemented this January 1st, 2017. The premium rate would have been 2 cents lower than it otherwise was. And that's because the experience within G22 was better than the overall board experience, which under the old model we were using to adjust the experience of G22. Everyone following me? So we removed the mitigating factor, what we thought was a mitigating factor, and now just let it purely stand on its own in terms of the 5-year average. And that had the result, or would have had the result, of actually taking 2 cents out of your premium rate. The next recommendation that Eckler had to do with the use of indicators to predict future costs. So I already just told you that we use 5-year averages to calculate what we expect in terms of spending in the future. Underneath that, or just before we do that, we actually, under the existing model, we try and forecast the number of claims. And then we attach an average cost per claim to the forecast of the number of claims. And that helps us then, or determines, what we call our revenue requirements need to be. The problem with that is that in recent years, we have seen significant decreases in injury rates, both at the time loss and total injury rate level, and significant decreases in the number of claims. However, the costs of the claims continues to increase. So using time loss counts as an indicator of the way costs might move is no longer valid, because there is no correlation anymore between how costs are moving and how number of injuries are moving. Injuries are on a steady decline, costs are on a steady increase. So what Eckler said is you need to stop using the number of time loss claims as an indicator of what the future costs might be. Stick to your 5 and 10-year average, but adjust that average by the change in the workforce. And change in the workforce simply means the percentage change of workers covered in that particular industry code. And when we graphed the change in cost with the change in workforce, they were almost 100% correlated. The lines were so close together. So in other words, it validated what Eckler was saying in terms of movement of the cost is far better correlated with movement of the change in workforce than are the time loss injuries. And so this recommendation, what we've accepted, is we will no longer use time loss claims to predict future costs. We will rely on the 5-year or blended 5-10-year average depending on the industry code, and we will adjust that for the change in the workforce. So if we're seeing a 5% growth in the workforce, we will assume that this average will grow by 5% in that same year. Kind of an inflationary factor. So what's the impact of this? So because of the volatility, particularly in these small rate codes that I talked about, several years ago we introduced something called blending. And so before we establish the final premium rate, what we've been doing in order to take the volatility of the premium rates is we've been blending the current year premium rate with the prior year's premium rate, basically averaging the two. So whatever the model would have spit out for 2017, we would have averaged that with the 2016 premium rate and charged you that. That's what we're charging you today, is a blend between the 2017 and 2016 experience because of the lack of reliability, if you will, in the model. So as we look at the impacts, there's two things at play here. If the blending may have resulted in us not having a premium rate that's truly representative of the experience, it could actually have been too high. If the blend of the premium rate is higher than what your experience alone would have shown, then you would see a decrease in your 2017 premium rate under the new model. On the other hand, if the correlation of your experience in your industry code, like what we're seeing at the overall board level, is between the changes in the workforce and not the changes in the time loss claims, then you're likely going to see an increase. So workforce has been fairly stable, growing somewhat in health sector, Time loss claims, on the other hand, going down. So if we remove the impact of time loss claims, which were adjusting down the cost per claim, and we put in workforce, which is at a higher growth level, you will see a bump in. So let's see what happens in G22. G22 would actually see a decrease of a penny. So, combination of blending as well as the impact of the change in workforce. So as a result of the blending, by removing the blending, the averaging between 17 and 16 premium rates, your premium would actually decrease by 14 cents. However, introducing the cost adjusted for change in workforce as a predictor, as an indicator of predicting costs, would have increased the premium rate by 13 cents. So the net result is a 1 cent decrease in the premium rate had we implemented this January 1st, 2017. The next recommendation that Eckler made that we've accepted relates to costly claims pooling, claims cost pooling. So I said earlier, collective liability is two things, has really two elements to it. First, that we are collectively responsible for all of the liability associated with the injuries that occur in our industry. But the second is that individual employers should not be unduly burdened by excessively expensive claims. Under the current model, we have a claims cost capping element to it, but it is limited to pension costs only. So when we talk about pension costs, these are long-term claims that probably have some permanent loss of earnings that will continue to receive some element of wage loss until they reach the age 65. So it's an earnings replacement, or pension is what we call it. So under the current model, if the cost of an individual claim for pensions exceeds $90,000, we cap those costs at $90,000. And the difference between the $90,000 and what the actual cost of that claim is gets spread across everyone in the G class, and I'll explain that in a minute. It gets spread across everyone in the G class based on their payroll. So if we have the G class refers to everybody whose rate code starts with G. And I think there's 4 of them in that class. So there's education, both like high school, that kind of thing, as well as post-secondary. It includes health, and it includes cities, towns, villages, municipalities. So every one of those is a G code, G11, G12, G22, and 31 maybe. So if health had a pension claim, an earnings replacement claim, the cost of which was, let's say, $150,000, we would cap that claim at $90,000, and the other $60,000, proportionately based on their payroll, would be absorbed by each of G11, G12, G22 would pick up a share, and G31. So collectively we share in that capping. Eckler said claim cost capping is a necessary part of a rate-making model. However, he said, the way you're approaching this isn't quite right. First of all, the $90,000 is a fixed amount. It's been in place for a number of years. Hasn't been indexed to anything. Eckler said if you're going to have a claims cap, it should somehow have an indexing provision to it. So as things change moving forward, the claims cost cap can escalate with it. Secondly, he said, it doesn't make any sense that you would apply that methodology only to pension costs. It should apply to all compensation costs. Eckler recommended that we establish a multiple of maximum insurable earnings to determine what that claims cost cap would be. And so what the board has approved is that we would use 3 times the ultimate maximum insurable earnings, which equates to just under $252,000 as the claim cost cap, and that would apply to all claims costs, not just pensions. The second part of that decision by the board was that the difference between, let me say, $252,000 and whatever the actual claim cost is would be spread among all employers at the board level. So across all 50 rate codes, based on their claims costs, not their payroll. So now we've spread the collective liability beyond the class, beyond those just 4 in the G class, to every rate code that we would have within our system. So if you have a claim for $400,000, you'll be responsible for the first 252. The other 148, if that's the right math, would actually be spread across all 50 rate codes based on their pro rata share of claims costs. So what's the impact of that on G22? Well, if G22 had a disproportionate number of expensive pension claims, they would have benefited from having the cap on that pension cost spread across G11, G12, and G31. By removing that and replacing it with this cap, it would have a negative impact. If, on the other hand, you had inexpensive pension costs and you were absorbing a portion of the other rate code's excess pension costs, you would likely see a decrease in your premium rate. So what's with G22? In fact, there would be a 3-cent increase. So the pension costs incurred by G22 relative to all of the G codes were more expensive than the average for that G class, and therefore by removing that, it would cause the premium rate to increase by 3 cents. The next recommendation dealt with fatality costs. Under the current system, we calculate an average cost per fatality for all fatalities that occurred over the last 10 years. And every rate code is charged the same amount, whether you had a fatality or not. 2017 rates include a 4-cent charge for fatalities that occurred in the previous 10 years within all 50 rate codes. Eckler said that's not very good accountability. What you should be doing is you should be holding rate codes that actually have fatalities more accountable for their own fatalities. Applying the same sort of thought processes in terms of the average of the last 5 years. So again, depending on the credibility, what's the average cost of your fatalities for the last 5 years? And what would that look like going forward, or a blend of the 5 and 10 years? Now, the cost of fatality can vary, from if it's an individual, single individual, only would be entitled to burial costs. That might cost like $10,000. However, an individual with a dependent spouse and let's say 3 dependent children could have a fatality of up to $1.6 million. So in order to recognize the diversity in the cost of fatalities, the board has said we're going to treat those fatalities like any other claim in the industry, which means we apply the same averaging, but also the capping of the claims costs would apply to fatality costs. So what's the impact on G22 as a result of that? Well, if your 5-year average cost of fatals within G22 is less than the 4 cents, you're going to benefit. And if it's more, then you would have seen an increase in your premium rate. So for G22, we'd actually see a reduction. In the last 5 years, so 2011 to 2015, G22 had 3 fatalities. But the average of those 3 fatalities was less than the 10-year average that we were charging you in 2017. So by removing that 10-year average and now holding G22 accountable for those 3 fatalities would have cost an extra, or would have decreased your rate by a penny. I mentioned earlier that we could pay claims for up to 50 years. And under the current model, I also told you, we calculate a 5-year average. And that 5-year average includes the costs of all claims paid in that 5-year period. So in any one of those 5 years, so again, for the 2017 premium rates, we're talking about years 2011 to 2015, being the 5 most recently completed years. In any one of those years, you could have a claim that's 20 plus years old, that occurred like 20 years ago, that still has costs associated with it that go into that particular injury year. Under the current model, we don't care when the injury occurred. If there's costs in that particular year, we're going to include it in calculating the 5-year average. The assumption being that in 2017, 20 years from then, you're going to have another injury just like that. Hector said that's not necessarily reliable or true. And because you're using such a broad brush, if you have low costs in the latter years of that claim, it serves to mask what the current experience is, because you're calculating this average over 50 years of costs. What he suggested is that we should be using a shorter experience period. I believe he recommended between 5 and 10 years. After our analysis, we determined that using 7 years, we would capture 75% of the costs. So instead of going back 50 years in every one of those 5 years, and including all costs in the calculation of the average, we will only go back as far as 7 years. So in 2011, we will include the costs of all claims that occurred in the previous 7 years. The same thing in 2012, 13, 14, 15. And that 7-year experience will be used to calculate the 5 or 10-year average. We're still going to have to pay those remaining 43 years of costs. So what do you do with that? Because we still have to raise that money. So again, what the board has approved is we would take those remaining 43 years, the costs in those 43 years, we would pool them, and based on claims experience, we would spread those proportionately across all 50 rate codes. So what's the potential impact on G22? Well, if the majority of your costs are in the most recent 7 years, then by dropping the other 43 years in the calculation of the average is going to drive up your average, which then will likely result in a bump in your premium rate. If the costs in those 43 years are greater than the costs in the most recent 7 years, by dropping those 43 years, we drop your average, and that should have the effect of lowering your premium rate. So in G22, the majority of the costs in G22 occur in the first 7 years of the claim. I don't think I actually have the percentage. As a result of us dropping those 43 years from the average, it would result in an 11-cent increase in the premium rate had we implemented this January 1st, 2017. The next recommendation had to do with the way we allocate our administration costs. So our administration costs, like all organizations, I think, are divided into 2 categories: fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are those that you incur kind of regardless of the level of the business you're in. So they're things like the cost of maintaining your building or having your buildings, the light, heat, water, your IT systems, the administrative support, like in our organization, the board and executive salaries, people who don't directly work on claims in particular, would all be considered our fixed costs. The variable costs are those related to all of those who actually work on claims. Under the current model, we've assumed that our fixed costs represent 10% of our total administration costs, and the remaining 90% are variable. The 10% fixed are spread across all employers on the basis of payroll. The 90% variable are spread across all employers proportionately on the basis of their claims costs. Ector said, great approach, but make sure your percentages are right, which caused us to undertake some analysis and actually divide our costs into the fixed and variable category. So variable category, again, is primarily just anything related to the management of claims, adjudication management of claims. The other fixed costs are anything that don't relate to that. When we did the analysis, we actually determined that our fixed costs are 30% of our total costs, and the variable are 70%. So we've adjusted the fixed component from 10 to 30%, which caused the variable to drop from 90 to 70%. We continue to allocate the fixed costs on the basis of payroll, and we allocate the variable costs on the basis of claims activity. So what does this mean to the G22 sector? Would result in a penny increase, would have resulted in a penny increase in the premium rate. So the variable component for G22 would actually have dropped by 5 cents, but the fixed component would have increased by 6 cents. So the net effect of the change from 90-10 to 70-30 would have been a 1 cent increase in the premium rate. So as you can see, we've been building up, attempting to show you the build-up of all of the impacts of the various enhancements to the rate-making model on the G22 rate code had we implemented this in the 2017 premium year. When we add up all the pluses and minuses, the net result would have been an 11 cent increase to the G22 rate. Based on payroll reported, this would have meant that you would have paid us an additional almost $2.8 million in premium in 2017. There are 468 employers in the G22 rate code, meaning on average, each employer would pay an additional $5,947. Now that's a one-time transitional cost, if you will, because once we move to the enhanced model, fully implementing the enhanced model, the model itself will determine what the future experience impact is. So if your injury experience improves, that will have an impact on your overall premium rate. But the transition amount is what we're trying to isolate so that we can understand from you your thoughts about how we best transition. So it's a good segue into what our next steps are. So the full presentation has been audio recorded, is available right now on webinar and will be on our website. So if some of your colleagues didn't have the opportunity, they're interested in seeing the webinar, they can go into the recorded version and see the audio and the slide deck on this. We will have plenty of time for questions here, so I welcome you, those in the room, to attend to the mic in the middle of the floor and ask your questions. Those of you online can submit those. If we don't happen to get all the questions within the next hour or so, those can always be submitted through askwcb@wcbsas.com. So just an email to this general email address. I know we've piled a bunch of information on you, and You may need some time to digest and think about this because you may not even know what question to ask right now. So if it occurs to you tomorrow, a week from now, or whatever, that I'm not sure I quite understand this, or I'd like to understand this a little bit more, fire us off an email at that email address, and we'll respond to you in the next day or two. We're also interested, though, in knowing your feedback about this transition. So in G22's case, we're looking at a transition in total of about $2.8 million. What the board's interested in hearing from you is your thoughts about how we transition that amount. So experience is going to run. What happens with your injury experience is going to dictate your future rates. But we have this kind of one-time move. It's going to cost this industry roughly $2.8 million, or at least that's the proxy based on 17, when we implement this new model. $5,900 roughly per employer. So what are the options? Well, we could implement it all at once, so your 2018 rate will be based on your 2018 experience, plus the transition amount. We could look at phasing that in over a couple of years. So if we did it over 2 years, you'd be looking at roughly $3,000 per year in additional premium for 2 years. Maybe a threshold. Any other thoughts you might have in terms of how we might mitigate the impacts of the transitional costs associated with moving from the old model to this enhanced model. If you go on our website, wcbsask.com/feedback, you'll see a little form there, like a questionnaire type thing that has a couple of options listed, but there's an other box there that you can put any other thoughts that would be you would like us to consider. That will be open until April 7th, so you have until April 7th to submit your feedback, your thoughts on the transitional approach that we might take. We will analyze all feedback that we receive from all of our sessions, provide that to our board, and then come up with a decision. The board will come up with a decision in terms of how it would like to proceed with this particular transition. So there's no need, to send off faxes or a whole bunch of individual emails. Just direct you to that website. If you wanted to collectively gather G22 thoughts about this and submit one on behalf of G22, that's fine. It could be done on a facility by facility basis, whatever best works for you, but we really like you to use that because we can then do analysis by having all of the data collected in one particular place. Just in closing, of course, it would be remiss of me not to reinforce the importance of injury prevention and our drive toward Mission Zero. The least expensive injury is the one that never occurs. When we introduced Mission Zero in 2008, many scoffed at us in terms of it being a pie-in-the-sky dream of ours. But I'm happy to tell you that in 2016, 88% of our workplaces went injury-free. So we have 12% more of the workplaces that we need to continue to work on. And of course, we appreciate all of the work and effort because this result's actually created by what's happening in the workplace, is not what's happening in the Workers' Compensation Board. And so we thank you for your ongoing commitment to reducing injuries in this province, but ask for your continued commitment towards driving us closer and closer to Mission Zero. Thank you all very much for participating here with us in Regina today, as well as all of those who have joined us through webinar, and I would now entertain any questions that any of you may have. If you're in the room, I would ask that you use the microphone, just because we are audio recording this, and we do want our colleagues who are participating through webinar to be able to hear and understand what may have been asked. So with that, over to you. Anything online, Carolyn? Well, if there is nothing, again, I would thank you all for joining us. Remember, again, you can submit your questions to us through AskWCB at WCBSAS.com, and please do provide us with any feedback and thoughts you might have about how we might transition from the existing model to the enhanced model. Thank thank you very much for taking time out of your day to be with us here this morning, and I wish you a safe and warm day. Thanks.